Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Kenric McDowell. Kenric is a musician, public speaker, and AI curator for Google Research. We discuss AI, inevitably, but not from either a lurid, the world is ending way, or from a techno-utopian jibber-jabber way. Instead, we look at what the implications of AI are for personhood, a theory of technology and its appropriateness, and whether we are teaching AI to think, or whether it is teaching us to. Enjoy. Kenric, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
All right, so question the first. Kenric, were you a weird kid?
I think so. I think I was a weird kid. But I didn't see ghosts, or it wasn't weird in that kind of way. I think just kind of demographically, I'm a weird person. I grew up in the East Bay in the Bay Area in California, which is a pretty diverse place, but I come from mixed heritage. I'm Filipino, Chinese, Spanish, Scottish, and Irish. So I'm kind of, ethnically queer, so to speak, in a bit of a weird demographic zone. So I think by virtue of that alone, I probably was a little weird. But in terms of my personality, I definitely was. I'm told I was somewhat imperious as a young child.
Samesies. Fair enough.
And it's funny. I did have a few very kind of small scale, maybe strange experiences, or capital W weird experiences. As a child in the form of fever dreams and kind of night hallucinations. And I've only met maybe one other person who could understand exactly what I was talking about.
But you elaborate on them, because now you've met two.
Yeah, well, so, when I was, I don't know, probably 5 years old or something like that, I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would feel as if my body were expanding to fill the room, and at the same time contracting to this very small point. It was almost like an out-of-body experience. And my sensations, and my fingers would be extremely amplified. And there was just kind of for a child, a kind of terrifying expansion of, my phenomenological field, I guess.
May I interrupt? Do you have a memory of as you got smaller? Because I had the exact same thing as part of one of my recurring dreams that I suspect might be a screen memory. Funnily enough, by the time this one comes out, last week's episode with Richard Dolan, we go over this as to whether or not it was a screen memory. Mm-hmm. Did you have the sensation of the actual fabric of the sheets and the fitted sheets getting larger and larger to the size of sort of rope? Like, that's how small you got? Because that was as I got smaller as well as larger, and my sensations became heightened so that things were painful. I was aware that the actual fabric was getting larger as I was shrinking into it.
That is really funny that you say that, because there was definitely it wasn't kind of like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and I'm getting lost in the fabric, but it was like I could feel the individual fibers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was it was almost like when you hear a microphone turned up really loud, it's terrifying because you know that something very loud could happen. Mm-hmm. There was a sort of physical analog to that experience, for sure, yeah.
So when I look back on them now, I have, and this is why I think there's a screen memory component, because I had other sort of sleep paralysis experiences, and this was kind of that. It almost came up too quick for me to recall now if it was a paralysis experience or not. But I have a memory of like a Dederidex Romulan warcraft that's sort of, but small, because this is when I was in the shrinking side, but also like a humanoid with like a bee head. And these motifs were recurring. And I'm still not sure. I don't know if that was a fever dream or not. But what makes it in that kind of iffy category for me is the sensations of it, the actual sensations of pain. Like, things felt at the small scale, I have memories of things like knitting needles, which were then very large. And then you start to think, I've got a few Whitley Strieber motifs going there. There's like needles and a spaceship and a bug-headed person in the room. And yeah, I don't know. That's interesting, Kenric.
That is very interesting. I do not have the kind of correlated, large-eyed visitors or any of that stuff within my memory, just the kind of pure physical phenomenological sensations. But it's very interesting that you also, I mean, you would be the second person I've spoken to that had a similar experience. Do
you remember any paralysis experience? Because I got that with the kind of classic hag attacks, which was my sort of second recurring genuine dread dreams I would have as a kid.
No, I haven't had very much, if any, sleep paralysis experience. I mean, I've had some that I kind of might have induced myself through doing lucid dreaming practices or something like that, but nothing kind of spontaneous.
Oh, cool. And was your family weird? Like, did you grow up in a family that facilitated, your imperious, unique interests?
No, if anything, they did their best to get me back on the path of humility. But I would say, actually, before being in the Bay Area, growing up when I did in the 80s, that my family is probably on the more normal side of the spectrum there. I mean, I look at drawings and stuff that I did as a child, and there are sort of themes that you would expect to see, like mushroom clouds and whales and things like that I probably saw in bumper stickers or something, but that wasn't necessarily coming from the home. My family was fairly conventional. Fairly conventional. So
were you doing art at a young age then, or is that just usual kids' drawings? Like, wait, let's move it into the teenies. Actually, I've got a new question. Sure. And it's a bit of a curveball, because it's actually, like, I had to think about it for me for a little bit. But what was the most impactful book you read in your teen years?
Ooh.
Right? Like, I think it's a good question, but you have to kind of go, oh, hang on, give me a minute.
Yeah, that might take me a while to.
All right, leave it.
Figure out. Yeah,
keep it in the back of your head, because I think that's going to be when I'm going to start trotting out more often.
I think this is probably like really obvious, but at The Doors of Perception.
Okay.
That was definitely a book that showed me a possibility, in terms of there being another world out there that could be accessed, and that it could be done in this kind of academic way versus maybe what was more native to the Bay Area.
Good choice. Definitely cooler than my choice. But anyway.
That's the best I got.
I think a lot of people will end up I'm pretty sure it's a close one race, because I read Pete Carroll and Crowley and all that in my teens, but like if it's most impactful, rather than looking back on it most, maybe one that defines how your life turned out, because I'd probably have to go with Pete Carroll in that case. But mine is the kind of very milquetoast vanilla answer of Cosmic Trigger. So you've got like the cool version of that.
Well, trust me, I wasn't cool.
All right, well, that's the next question done. All right, well, let's. I mean, we're going to head into talking about what you do as a job and so on, but let's take it from Kenric reading Doors of Perception. Where did you decide to go career and college-wise and so on?
I did my undergrad at San Francisco State University, and I went in as a music composition major, and quickly, I found I was just kind of doing math with these kind of, common practice period musical rules, and it was really boring. And I tried electronic music as a major, and then eventually kind of created my own hybrid path, which involved digital media art, basically, and music. And as a result, I ended up working in a game development studio in the sort of like right at the very end of the .com craze. And so I kind of got a taste of what that world was like, learned how to program, and kind of saved myself from a career as a barista. And right when it was all about to crumble. I was very involved in the music world too at the time, and that whole industry was also kind of undergoing a strange transformation. So a lot of my early education was around music, art. No, I wouldn't call it computer science because it was really much more hacky than that. But then kind of becoming a self-taught computer, software engineer during my college years and after. I did go on to get my MFA in photography later in New York.
Yeah, wow. Be more 90s, my goodness. So doing music during the Napster era, and working in games companies and so on. That's cool. That you got cool in the end then, Kenric.
Sheer dumb luck, I promise.
All right, cool. So in a way, that's quite a good preamble, unless there's other stuff that we want to talk about beforehand. But I mean, let's begin with what's AMI?
So AMI is a program at Google Research and Google AI that is focused on supporting artists and people that are exploring creatively AI technology. So we have a team. We have a staff creative technologist. I've got a colleague with whom I lead the program, and then we have a bunch of what at Google are called 20%ers, people who kind of volunteer, to work with us as engineers or as writers or in different capacities. But there's a core team of a few people that run this, and we bring artists in, we collaborate with them. There are engineers that are also artists themselves, like Mike Taika, who worked on the Deep Dream release. We basically are supporting this kind of emerging practice of using machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies creatively. I like to always point back to our sort of totem animal, which is this really strange picture called trippysquirrel.jpg that leaked on Reddit in the summer of 2015. Are you familiar with this picture?
Oh, yes, I'm familiar with that moment, and yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so that is kind of, whenever I give a talk, I always show Trippy Squirrel first, because Trippy Squirrel kind of escaped from the research team and made its way onto the internet. And when people were like, they saw this image, which to describe, it's very hard to describe. It's kind of like, I don't know. Would you want to take a crack at describing it?
Trippy Squirrel is a kind of like multi-dimensional, multi-faced, phasing between dimensions. It's a multi-dimensional squirrel that's trying to like be in this one dimension. If people will be familiar with Deep Dream. If not, guys, if you're driving, you just Google Trippy Squirrel, you'll get it. I'll hopefully remember to put it in the show notes. I did a Deep Dream post in 2015 when that came out, actually, because there were some super fun ones that the people like. There was like from memory, my favorite, and not for that reason, someone put in like the naked Justin Bieber image into it once it was available, and that's really funny to see, like, stuff on, like, faces on butts. I think that's why I liked it.
The way you describe it makes it sound like something from a China Mieville story or something.
Right, exactly.
Great. But that leak kind of initiated an effort from my director, Blaise Aguirre-Yarcas. He was kind of like, we should do some art. We should have an art show or something. And I was like, hold up. There's 200 people in this organization. I'm the only one with an MFA. Like, let me help. And then, a year later, that was my job.
So did you get into Google for, I don't want to say boring reasons, but for like programming reasons? And then once you're in there, it turns out, oh, look, we have this kind of digital artist, musician, West Coast weirdo in the corner here. He could be, this is a good asset to use to kind of build the program around. Or were you sort of cherry-picked from the wide, wide world for AMI?
No, I that would be nice if these kind of things happen that way. But the truth is that I came in as a UX prototyper. So I was, making software prototypes. I came into a team that was doing real-time communication. And then within a few months, actually I should back up a little bit, because there's something that felt kind of strangely fated about all this. I had applied for a job at Google in, I think it was late 2013, and I was actually in the jungle in the Amazon, sitting kind of in the middle of the day, just hanging out in the heat. And this voice popped into my head and said, AIs are the children of humanity. They need to learn to love and to be loved. Otherwise, they'll become psychopaths and kill everybody. And I had no real interest in AI other than as a sort of science fiction concept and as like an avid reader of Philip K. Dick. But that experience kind of foreshadowed my entrance into Google, which happened many months later in a totally different team. And then, a few months after joining this team, my manager at the time was like, "Hey, we're going to move everyone into AI research. Do you want to come?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." So I did come in for sort of ostensibly boring reasons. I ended up doing speculative design, which was more interesting and, than just, normal day-to-day design. But it was certainly for kind of prosaic, needs that any tech company has.
It's funny how those quote-unquote jungle encounters demonstrate a better understanding of the timeline, because I have a couple of them myself that turned out to be, to have shown some eerie foreknowledge, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Well, we actually got DMing after a recent solo show, and you mentioned AI, for instance. So, actually, no, before we get to that, let's do this. I'm looking at my questions in this order. We'll do it this way. Bear with us, non-technical people, because we're going to try and, I'm not that technical anyway. What is a neural net, Kenric?
A neural net is a data structure that is a sort of cartoon version of a human neuron or any kind of animal neuron. So a way of thinking about it is it's sort of like a stick figure drawing of a piece of our own brains. And that very, very basic, reduced structure, when extended with multiple copies and kind of stacked up, can create a very powerful processing system that is nonlinear compared to the rule-based technologies and computational models that we have now.
And what's Deep Dream? Because we were just talking about it. And it spits out trippy squirrels and faces on Justin Bieber's butts, but what's Deep Dream?
Deep Dream was an attempt by an engineer in Zurich named Alex Mordvinstev to understand. So when I was talking about stacking up these neurons, he was trying to understand what was happening at each level of that stack of neurons. So he was working with an image processing system that was developed for YouTube to classify images. And the way it works is it sees an image and it outputs a label. He was basically running it backwards and trying to get a sort of idea of what the images, what the recognition was that was happening inside of these different layers of the neural net. So he kind of turned a processing and image recognition system into an image generation system.
And there's a couple of presentations I've seen of yours on YouTube where you use the bird as an example. So there's a whole bunch of characteristics that it looks for on each different layer or level to determine whether it will assign bird to it, right? But if you ask for it to say, "Give me a bird," what comes out does not look like what went in.
No, and that has a lot to do with the way that these systems work, which is that they look for features of visual features that birds exhibit in photographs that they're given by people training the neural nets. So there isn't some kind of encounter with an actual bird. There's a highly mediated, highly structured, labeled data set with images of birds, and the features that can be extracted from what those images have in common become kind of the visual recognition or the visual definition of a bird to that system. So there's no understanding that birds fly, that they're tiny dinosaurs, that they lay eggs. There's none of that kind of contextual awareness. It's really just a feature recognition. And if there are enough features that look bird-like enough, then you get that recognition, which is why you can have what are called adversarial examples, where you show a system that's meant to recognize cars. You show it like a thing that, or like things that are meant to recognize turtles or something, and you give it like a weird abstract image, like this project that Tom White recently did with AMI, and it says, oh, it misrecognizes it. A very abstract thing, if it has the right shapes, can trigger recognition. So it's a very contextless type of recognition.
All right, I'm asking that one just for people who are watching, because you said something there. It spits out essentially its definition of a bird. Mm-hmm. And that's different from ours. And here's the clue for people listening, particularly premium members. So its perspective, what a bird looks like from the software's perspective is different to what a bird looks like from our perspective. So, but I feel like we needed to get what's a neural net, what's deep dream, and so on out of the way before we get to what even am AI. And here's a weird one. If it were up to you, would you call it that?
That's a great question. There is a heavy narrative burden that name comes with, just cinematically and in terms of science fiction. So I think it would be advantageous to have a better definition, something that was maybe less loaded with these type of expectations. But the convenience of that definition and that cinematic presence is that people know roughly what you're talking about, so that's kind of what the conversation gravitates around in terms of pop definitions. But
there are the problem is in both words in the definition: artificial as opposed to natural, which means you are bringing an Enlightenment assumption to it to begin with, and intelligence, which you're also bringing an Enlightenment assumption to, assuming that it goes unsaid that the intelligence we are looking for is anthropocentric.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part.
Right. Yeah, it's certainly there in that framing and the way that it's kind of received in culture, absolutely. And that's obviously not the case. It's not an anthropomorphic intelligence, and I think design-wise, it is anthropocentric, though it is. Sure, it's treated towards anthropocentric ends, fortunately or not.
All right, so talk about that difference then. So, because I think this is important for people to kind of understand that if you think of AI from a Hollywood perspective, or the things that Elon Musk is afraid of, what we typically mean is, we expect a moment in time will come where an artificial intelligence will appear and be a sort of more complex and more dangerous version of us.
Yes, right. At risk of maybe diverting or not answering your question directly, the thing that I kind of keep thinking of is this idea that you could actually replace unfettered capitalism, replace AI with the phrase unfettered capitalism at most points of the conversation, and you would get the same kind of result when it comes to these fears, because these fears are amplifications of the narratives of technology and Silicon Valley, right? So if, Elon Musk is afraid of, a robot that wants to turn the world into paper clips, that's because those are the models we have for what technology does, right? It's productive of products. It transforms natural resources into consumable products. So, there is a sort of Terminator idea out there, this idea that you would create some super powerful kind of technological deity that would have a will of its own that we can't control in a kind of Frankenstein type of way. Or, I think closer to the real dangers are that we would amplify existing power structures towards the existing unquestioned ends of our system, and that those would accelerate the already present dangers within our social construct, our economic construct.
Yeah. I don't think that was a diversion at all. I think that kind of teed up where I want to take this next for people listening. So if we kind of get the idea that a lot of the fear and assumptions hang around essentially a false binary. Is this quote-unquote artificial consciousness human yet or not, if you will? Because that binary, and you kind of mentioned this, it's actually way far downstream from the kind of meteor ontologies of both technology itself and personhood. And it kind of calls to mind your unbidden kind of spirit contact in the desert, in the jungle, rather. There's, if you consider it from an animist perspective, children can mean a lot of things rather than a kind of like genetic facsimile of parents. In that sort of context, rivers and mountains, or we are children of rivers and mountains, and so on. So if you're getting that in the desert, it does necessarily, it's in the jungle, sorry. I was recently in the desert. If you're getting that in that kind of context, it does rather suggest that we can do the kind of step one animist analysis of extending personhood beyond the human, because that kind of singularity, well, not really the singularity, but kind of, is when it turns into a person as we understand it as a human, so a human person. But personhood exists for the most part, in non-human form, frankly.
Right. And I think there's a couple things to tackle there, right? There's the kind of preliminary social justice critique, which is that, not even all biological humans have achieved legal personhood in many cases. So why consider these more abstruse concerns with regards to machines when we should be focusing on kind of where we're falling down with regards to our nearest family members, which is absolutely valid. And I think there's a more philosophical concern as well, which is when we speak about personhood in this, along the lines of these anthropomorphic concerns, we are doing it from a very specific ontology most of the time, and it is not articulated. So one of the efforts that we've undergone in the program has been to bring in philosophers like Timothy Morton, Benjamin Bratton, the artist Tito Sterl, and the speculative design theorist Sheldon Brown. We brought those four in to work with us on some kind of brainstorming around ontological assumptions that we're bringing to the design discourse. And what we found was that with any kind of critical lens, whether you're, taking a philosophy of science lens, an urbanism lens, a pure philosophy lens, our ontological construction of a person, within the design discourse of technology is very limited. And it usually amounts to a single ego in a vacuum-sealed body with a credit card and a phone. And that can decompose into so many different sort of sub-elements. It can compose into larger assemblages with, tribes, with families, with urban groups, and it can compose into larger ecological assemblages as well. So the idea of kind of approaching the ontology question in order to get to the personhood question, I think that has been the most fruitful approach for me and for us, is to really unpack that first. Because if we start trying to understand personhood vis-a-vis machines, vis-a-vis animals and plants and the landscape, et cetera, like we really need to dive deep into what personhood is and what our ontology is, which is a very hard conversation to make time for in most business contexts.
No, absolutely. The reason I wanted to talk about Deep Dream and it spitting out crazy birds is what we're kind of talking about here. If you have a wider model of personhood, you're in what De Castro would call a sort of perspectivist ontology, right? So that the baseline of reality is perspective. That's the kind of stuff that it's made of. And different forms of person see differently based on their body. So for instance, jaguars see other jaguars as humans, and they see jaguar caves as human houses, and so on. But jaguars will see us as prey, and if we lose eye contact with them, they'll see us as meat. So, but we will see like other things as meat, and that's what they are. Like the actual meaning is there, and it's the bodily form that changes the perspective of what it happens to be. So jaguars see human blood as manioc beer because that's what a person drinks, right? Whereas we see manioc beer as person drink, and you see this kind of difference. Now, what's interesting to me about that is I think we can give Deep Dream some form of personhood because it has a perspective, right? So the bird that it spits out is what a bird looks like or is based on its body, which is non-existent, but that's a form of body. So it's very interesting to me that we can kind of slide what people may not necessarily, again, because they're expecting AI to be like Haley Joel Osment, like that's when we have AI. Not necessarily. We may already have digital persons because that entirely satisfies the kind of perspectivist definition. It has agency and perspective, is thus a person. So here we're in a situation of going, well, goodness, consider how many digital persons we're surrounded by if something, I don't want to say as simple as Deep Dream, because it isn't, but if something as comparatively simple as Deep Dream, as far as I'm concerned, already has status of personhood, that's an interesting discussion, surely.
Yeah, this is where, I'm not deeply versed in it, but the object-oriented ontology conversation seems to be trying to approach some of these to construct a ground level ontology where we can have these type of interactions with different forms that have different kind of inputs and outputs and different phenomenological relations with each other. But in terms of, I think maybe the question that really arises when it comes to how personhood has mapped or not mapped to representation legally, and existence within the sort of legislative framework of, who is an actor in society. I think that's maybe a hidden assumption that we kind of bring to personhood as well. So a sort of animistic ontology that would allow that would maybe some of the reasons why that feels surprising to people is because we kind of correlate those things with a legislative presence or a democratic presence.
Yeah, which the tides are changing there. There are rivers in New Zealand that are legal persons now, so that's good. But like on this, because I was just putting the questions together, are we teaching AI to think, or is AI teaching us to think?
Well, this is another thing I love to speak about because it's been shown that tool making in the past has had a very significant effect on our neurobiology and its kind of latent capacities. I'm thinking specifically of some research from Emory University, where a team of scientists were using fMRIs to study how people's brains change when they make tools in the kind of Paleolithic stone chipped axe kind of model. And there was a growth in the centers of the brain correlated with gesture, which also correlate with spoken language. So the implication was that by making these tools, depending on which version of ancient human history you subscribe to, but let's just say, we were kind of languageless and making tools with stone, we would have been strengthening the centers of our brain related to gesture. And that paved the way for spoken language. In this, these are the implications of this research. So I like to point to some of the novel structures in machine learning architecture, these neural nets, and their inherent high dimensionality. It's like a bit much to explain right now, but the point of it is that when you engage with sensory experiences that are driven by these neural net architectures, there's a high degree of multidimensionality that's being made sensible. And my intuition is that aesthetic experience will strengthen some perceptual network in our brains that allows us to engage with highly multidimensional experiences.
I think it's a good intuition because we see the same thing. And I've been thinking about how to describe the levels of dimensionality, and we'll come back to that in a sec. But I think if people do... so in Ernesto de Martino's model, cultures that have a stronger belief in magic experience stronger magical effects. And we know that in our personal lives, you kind of get the same... You get better at different modes of thinking or thinking with the more you meditate, for instance. So we know that there's a neuroplasticity component to novel modes of thought that make it easier and better, and you start thinking different things. And I guess we should probably do this. Let's attempt to talk a little bit about that extra... layers of dimensionality, because I don't know if you've read How Forests Think, but there's an interesting corollary to it, which is kind of where I want to go with this discussion, which is, let's talk about AI in wider implications. But there's essentially new correct, what's the word I'm looking for here? New data emerge as you get kind of more complex in dimensions that isn't apparent at lower dimensions. So this is something... So we're learning new things because we can essentially run more complex thinking processes. Does that make sense? Is that a good way of... But we're learning new true things that were like, because they're emergent from this complexity. It's not like a... Yeah, this is difficult. Jump in here. This is your actual job.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would say, maybe at risk of like touching a third rail, I would say that the recent scientific understanding of sex is quite interesting. Not the act of sex, but the sort of what's been conventionally mapped to gender. That, for example, the more we understand about the body, the more we realize that each of our cells has its own sex chromosomes, and that there's such a thing as chimeric genes and DNA, where mothers will carry their children's DNA and children will carry their mother's DNA, and some people can take a DNA test and what comes out of their mouth is different than what comes out of other parts of their body. So the sort of, every time we kind of adapt our low dimensional model to a new level of complexity, it kind of breaks, and we're forced to find new language. And because of our new language, we're forced to create new architecture and bathroom signage and whatever you want, So I think that's I think your framing is right. And, I would say it's a very simple model. It's just like increasing complexity requires increasingly accurate language.
And what's interesting to me about this is the stuff that emerges from the more kind of complex processing, so the higher dimensional processing, is true, and in a weird way true in that kind of latent in the data, and it was just our low resolution interaction with it beforehand that shows it wasn't there. And what fascinates me about this is that you can kind of align it to Charles Fort's dominant model, which is things are, as you move between dominant, so moving out of science into dominant of wider inclusion, things are actually true. So it's a different model to the Enlightenment or structures of scientific revolution idea, which is that we just get better at finding more detailed things that were already there. Like, truth actually shifts in the dominant model. So it's fascinating to see that there's, like, the gender stuff that you presented, I think I watched the Gray Area video, was really, really fascinating at what emerged at a higher dimensional level. And I think that's, like, that reminded me of Fort. Like, that's actually true in a wider inclusion model, a wider inclusion dominant now, if that makes sense.
Right. And to bring it maybe around to your audience's kind of core interest, I would say experientially, we can understand that through gnosis, right? Where we kind of have a Gnostic experience through some technique that we practice, understand something on a very visceral, intuitive level, and then go back into the world where we have this crude model and try to convince somebody that what happened to us was real. And they're like, well, no, that can't be, because there's not even a word for that, What I hope is that in this kind of, in this dominant that we're entering into, that science will help play a role in articulating how those truths can be without reducing them.
Absolutely. We'll talk about how forests think, because this is a way, I think, to stitch together, weirdly, AI and kind of emergent truth at higher dimensions and all the rest of it. I don't know if you're familiar with Eduardo Cohn's work, or how familiar you are with it, but
somewhat.
Yeah, I know there are people out there who maybe aren't, so I'll try and essentially. His book is based on the idea that language needs to be provincialized. Because what we do as humans is we conflate representation with human language. But human language is symbolic thinking, right? Which is a tiny, tiny subset of all available representational processes. Now, that sounds a bit complicated for people listening. So what that essentially means in a how forests think context is that Cohen observed, based on, in principle, his field experience with the Runapunuma, that there are other much wider and more common forms of communication. There's iconic, there's two, and he bases this on earlier research, but it's too detailed for now. There's iconic representation, which is the appearance of likeness and similarity in the forest, and that's animals mimicking other animal sounds, stick insects mimicking sticks, and so on. So you have, across a forest or an ecosystem, it is communicating iconically constantly. So it's actually doing representation, call and response back for a variety of different reasons. And this is a language that the forest understands. And the next one is indexical, which is pointing. So it's a sign, I guess, that points to a thing or has some connection to it. So it's the sound a monkey makes for other monkeys when there's a jaguar nearby, or whatever it happens to be. It can be, or even a sound a bird makes to monkeys when there's a jaguar nearby. That's probably a better example if we're trying to get the understanding of what's going on here. But the reality is there is pointing and representation for a bunch of different reasons. Sometimes play. Sometimes it's just for the hell of it, like birds that will just start, doing cover band versions of other animals in the forest, right? And that's the overwhelming majority of it, which we have as humans. We have that as well. And we have this other thing. We have symbolic thinking. And which emerges out of these two, because we all kind of live with and through these signs. And the point he makes, which I think is brilliant, and it's how we kind of incorporate a wider thinking of AI in, is he essentially says that the reason the book isn't called like How Humans Think, Forests Think, is the fact that thinking is evident outside of humans is how we can think beyond the human in the first place. So the fact that we could identify forms of thinking that are non-human in the world is how we can identify it in the first place. It sounds a bit crazy until you sit with the idea. But then all of a sudden, we come back to something like Deep Dream, with its mimicry and signs pointing and the things that it produces. And all of a sudden we have, like, the forest can include essentially the internet at this point, and we're now dealing with I mean, what do you think there's, I suspect there are models in this kind of emergent way of using kind of like best-in-class anthropology that can really shine lights on how we start thinking with AI as a field.
Yeah, absolutely. What you were saying reminded me a bit of the question, are machines teaching us to think? And it's that kind of, that visibility of a sort of type of thought that folds back into our own model of our own thinking. I think that's what you were getting at. And there's certainly, for example, with image recognition, we're aware that there's a certain amount of processing that happens actually in our eyes. And the image recognition neural nets are structured in some ways that are similar to the neural tissue in the eyes. And that's kind of like a precognitive image processing, that happens almost on a physical level. So I think there are ways where these things are amplifying our awareness. But to get back to the point about anthropology, yes, I think the danger in applying models from cultures that have different ontologies, different ways of constructing the world, is that, how can I put this? We'll maybe take what we want from those models without really deeply inhabiting those models and understanding that those models have value systems with relationship to technology that might not be the same as ours.
Oh, sure.
And I'm thinking maybe to bring it back to spirit contact, like, I don't want to be disappointing, but the only kind of response I've ever gotten from raising the question of technology with the entities that I have worked with is that they're very dismissive of it. It's particularly AI. They're like, yeah, sure, I guess. I mean, it's really brittle. I think from the point of view of a spirit inhabiting biology and ecosystems, AI feels very kind of toy-like.
Well, toy-like it is. I mean, this kind of comes back to the other half of what needs to be interrogated when you talk about AI, which is technology. And again, I think you find because I want to go back to the reason I pick people like De Castro and Cohn is, rather than the Runapuma or any of the individual tribes, is that it has already been, De Castro calls any act of translation theft. But it's already been made bioavailable to my background and context by virtue of the fact that it is an academic theory at this point, rather than so they've kind of had to manage the moral, and they're better equipped for it than I am, especially when it comes to morals just in general, but they've had to manage that kind of that fraught path, and it's an essential one, because you can't just get stuck in this sort of Western relativism of keeping people in little bubbles. That's my problem with object-oriented ontology. I think it's dumb. I think it atomizes rather than moves into a flow model. But nevertheless, it's more palatable than a flow model for the kind of people or the people in the field you work in. So if they start there, then maybe you can get them onto Tim Ingold at some stage. But the sort of blob model I don't think works. And why is because we come back to technology as an extension of human personhood, specifically, and an extension of human personhood as a result of interaction with the more than human world. So I'm obviously very interested in the extra-dimensional origins of things like language and technology and so on. And I kind of get why the spirit world isn't that interested in AI, because at the moment, even though they will satisfy a definition of person, it remains a extension of a human person. It remains technology. It remains a thing that allows us to have that wider, or shall we say, higher dimensional interaction with the cosmos.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to process there. I think that, well, I guess the question when it comes to, let's maybe, for me, like a very grounding space is the space of design, right?
Sure.
So the question of how to relate to that capacity as a tool, an extension, versus a uniquely separate entity or a sort of like individuated intelligence or consciousness, that's a very revealing frame to put that in terms of, animist cosmologies or, the worldview of the Runapuma. Those frames are very helpful, because a lot of times when we look at, distinctions that people are trying to make between assistants and kind of models like Alexa and Siri versus like tool-oriented extensions of oneself, and where that boundary really is. I mean, I think what you're saying really makes it clear that any kind of entity that claims to have any separate persistence, whether it's personified as like Alexa or Siri or something more complex, will ultimately be an extension of a human, especially from an ecological perspective. is very much nested or built up on top of our infrastructure, and so can never truly be separate from us in that way.
Well, it can also never truly be separate from anything else. So Alexa is built of rare earth minerals brought in from China, at least at the moment, right. and petrochemicals brought in from the Middle East, and kind of put together as this device. So it's made of earth as well as human. So that's why I like a flow model better than object-oriented ontology, because that's kind of the point. What you do get with I would say being inspired by animist cosmologies is the definition of personhood hinges on perspective, which we can demonstrate in a few cases, or agency. So not every rock is a person, but ones that have done things or that are sacred in some way are. And this comes back to your spirit contact in the jungle. The idea that AI being mankind's children is very similar to what you will find with objects, sacred objects as persons around the world, which is you have a responsibility for them. They are hugely potent and a part of your tribe or family or whatever's journey, and are part of the family, but they do tend to be weapons or skulls or something for the most part, but well, not for the most part, but they're good examples. So if you look at some of the Maori taonga, there are these great big greenstone weapons. You would not want to get hit with it. It's a very, very hard stone, and people obviously historically have been hit with them. And so you have these persons these non-human persons that are quote-unquote objects. And I think that's the kind of other piece. I don't know how it hinges together. I'm just trying to throw it in there because out of some of these kind of thinking, because we have we have perspective and we have demonstrable agency. And we also have a way of putting those two things together that allows for something to be both a object, but also a person as responsibility. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, I think, maybe getting into some of the nitty-gritty of these provocations that we should be looking to animist models, or we should be looking to, the conversation that Jason Louv and I had at the Serpentine, of that we should stop just importing Abrahamic, constructions into our relationship with AI, but actually start looking at other models across the whole diverse spectrum of human wisdom traditions. When we get into it, I think it's these types of terms like agency and personhood, and really getting to working definitions of those within these larger contexts, and even as a means to import those contexts into the conversation. If we can't get Silicon Valley to care implicitly about ecology per se, perhaps we can have a conversation around a worldview that has an implicit relation with ecology, and that's a way of kind of sneaking the discourse in via the fetish for personifying machines.
It's so weird that you say that, because that was exactly my idle fantasy, was if you could have a 3-day workshop with top 5 companies working on quote unquote AI, to just go, guys, I'd introduce them to various anthropologist works and go, look, we're going to leave after 3 days with an understanding of mutually agreed in the context of AI research, what things like agency and personhood are, because you wouldn't, the body of work, the totality of work that's been done on AI already would look very different to the people in that room after 3 days. And the trick there is if you can kind of neuroplastic their minds into thinking that way, then they will quickly work out, wait a minute, well, within personhood, agency, interconnected flow model, we should stop cutting down the Amazon.
That is the dream, yes.
Cool. We're going to go back to technology. So what I like about some of the discussions I've seen of you in this area is that you do put it technology in the development of AI in the context of the, I guess, history of technology. This is problematic because it goes up and down in complexity over 2.5 million years. What to everyone, you can't have an AI conversation, and we should probably end it on this, without doing the wild speculation thing. So once we once we're adjusted to a higher number of dimensions in our dimensional thinking, like, where are you? What's like a utopian version of what this would look like? Because we've got Elon Musk's negative one. What do you think? What would you like to see happen, or hope to see happen, from where research is now in a kind of like 5 to 10 year arc?
Oh man, that's tough. I mean, I guess I can work up to it by starting with the kind of 50-50 version, which I may have told this story before, but I'll tell it again. I had a dream, and in the dream I was floating over the earth, and there was a man who approached me, and he kind of looked like Steve Jobs or something, and there were all these satellites everywhere, and there were these kind of like etheric satellites, and he was like, "We're actually now 100 years from your present time, and I'm going to show you what the earth is like." And we're kind of floating over the earth, and it was, what he said was, the earth is a 50-50 planet. It's neutral. It's neither good, it's not tilted towards the good, and it's not tilted towards the bad. And as time progresses and more complexity emerges, there's not going to be a sort of, this was before 2012 and around the time that there was all this sort of 2012 hype, and he was like, there's not going to be a utopia, there's going to be a increasing complexity, and that's really all it is. And he was showing me like people cleaning up the environment, and there's like Burning Man parties happening all over the world, and like AI and all this crazy stuff. But the point of the message that was being delivered then was that it's there wasn't going to be a sort of like transformation into a utopia, and that the idea that we need to maintain a sort of neutral position as a place of existence for souls to be born into and to have experiences, kind of like that was the blessing of this place, of the earth. So having said that, I mean, I'm like fully in favor of the fully automated luxury gay space communist, whatever. Like if we get to do that, then great. The culture novels, that kind of model of post-scarcity. The liberation of creativity, the liberation of time for philosophical speculation, for like understanding truth, all of those things, those higher ideals. We could all just hang out playing the glass bead game in space and getting high, then like amazing, sure. But I think the more realistic part of me wants to just say that, we need this, we need karma,
Yeah.
But I think complexity, really handling complexity, is the call for this time, and the time to come. And the tools that we have for doing that are, maybe technological, but more often they're neurological, and they're organic, and they're being held by indigenous people.
Yeah, I would say so. And because I was going to moderate ghost Steve Jobs by saying, well, is it increasing complexity, or do we head towards utopia by increasing appropriateness of technology, which is complex in some cases and much less complex in others? Like that's kind of, I think, how we get to the space communism. Because if you look at, maybe it's optimization of complexity. And I think you're right that navigating that, because if we don't, things will just get more complex. And that's an ecosystem just before collapse, That's the algal bloom,
It's funny, we've been having this heat wave globally, but especially here in LA. And I was hanging with some friends nearby, and it was so hot and no one wanted to do anything. And I was just like, maybe this is the answer. Like, it just is going to get so hot that no one's really going to do anything, and we'll just decelerate because we're so sweaty that we can't do anything else.
I love it. I think you're also you're right there that, well, we've looked everywhere else. Here's the point. It's the kind of death rattle of imperialism. It turns out that probably cultures that have continually existed over tens of thousands of years and seen enough ice ages probably have something to share that will, contribute on that global basis. But I like your vision of, well, everyone wants a space communism, but I like the call to navigate complexity, and I also, because this is the other side of technology. I don't think the solution is to stop using it. It's to have a more nuanced approach to it, and maybe, although this is literally impossible now, and these are some of the things that need urgent changing, like you actually can't buy a mobile phone that hasn't been made via slave labor in some way. Like that one company that tried it couldn't actually get the components from factories that actually satisfied workplace conditions. So if you look at how we're tangled in technology, it is an inappropriate relationship, but I think the way out is through rather than out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have to agree that out is a very confusing direction.
No, cool. Well, this is really fun. I'm glad we managed to talk about complex, awesome stuff without hopefully getting too complicated for people / me. Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been an incredible pleasure.
Yeah, it's been good. It's been good to. I wasn't even stoned for it, but I feel stoned now. People who want to know more about yourself, or where do they find you on the internet, all that kind of stuff, Kenric?
Well, I have a website which is kenricmcdowell.com, KenricMcdowell, and you can find my Twitter and Instagram from there, and a few lectures and conversations if you want to hear me talk some more.
Cool.
And then the program is at g.co/AMI.
Awesome. Well, all that stuff will, of course, be in the show notes. And this is brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon.
Okay, so this is one of the more chaos magic things I've said in a while, but it is compelling to think with the notion of emergent truth being expressed in higher dimensions, which we touched on in the show, alongside, say, the Aboriginal dreaming notion that the plant is the dream of sunlight. The sort of telos of complexity changes in a flow model, and again, just very useful to think with. And it's not just up and down in the sense that, increased dimensionality yields newer and potentially more, or actually sometimes less, complex truths, but also left and right along the timeline of human experience. Dr. James Harrod, for instance, has tentatively matched human symbolic development, or even hominin symbolic development, to 4 major waves of tool innovation over 2.5 million years. And interestingly, the last couple of 100,000 years broadly map to Witzel's model of the development of human mythologies, which we discuss at tremendous length in Starships, of course. This leaves the door open for a Campfire's Edge analysis, which is a presentation you'll find in the premium members area if you don't know what I'm talking about, which is to say, human technological complexity does not simply increase over time, but increases and decreases in complexity through various collapses, calamities, and, most importantly, fundamental changes to the way we interact with the spirit world. In both Drs. Harrod and Witzel's analysis, the very first point in the timeline where a hominin receives/develops the first technology goes eternally unexplained, except, as you know, if you've seen the presentation, that it is remembered in our oldest mythologies as some kind of trickster/emissary coming down and teaching it to us, or imparting it to us. So, although this is certainly up for critique, you could almost make the case that AI might be only the second ever time something so quote-unquote alien happened, because it is constituted of a fundamentally different arrangement of agency and capacity to think/communicate in the Eduardo Kohn sense, to say a saintly relic or a famous warship. With that in mind, it is fascinating to consider, based on Kenric's experiences, for example, the various classes of spirit opinions of technology, and in particular, modern technology like AI or machine intelligence. When you're in ceremony with ayahuasca versus mushrooms, you can get a very different read on the role of technology, which in some sense is surprising given the entities one encounters under the influence of DMT. But you're probably aware, Terence McKenna sometimes used a broad and, I guess, messy categorization that Aya is a means of deepening our relationship with Earth, whereas mushrooms, which he thought, and I probably do too, came from space and are more interested in where we can go next in, the distant future, rather than how to be situated in place right now. But if AI is something wholly new, rather than yet another technology transfer across the extra-dimensional border from our current or historic more-than-human companions, then how would they have a frame of reference for it, or a coherent opinion on it? Very much food for thought. And if you like thought food, be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, or in your favorite podcatcher. Head over to runesoup.com or the Runesoup Facebook page, or hit me up on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.